They called him Lepke, Little Lewis's in Yiddish. But there was nothing little about what he built. Murder Incorporated killed for money, and Louis Buchalter sat at the top directing death like a CEO managing inventory. New York City, 1897. Louis Buchalter was born into the teeming poverty of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe crowded into tenements, working brutal factory jobs for pennies. His parents had fled the pogroms of Europe, chasing America's promise of safety and opportunity. They found neither, just different forms of suffering, different types of exploitation. Louis was the youngest of several children, and his childhood was marked by hardship from the beginning. His father, a hardware store owner, died when Louis was young, plunging the family into deeper poverty. His mother struggled to support the children, working endless hours while trying to keep them fed and housed. The Lower East Side wasn't a neighborhood. It was a survival zone where weakness meant starvation. Young Louis learned early that legitimate work offered no escape from poverty. He watched his mother destroy herself working for wages that barely sustained life. He saw his neighbors laboring in sweatshops, dying young from exhaustion and disease. The lesson was clear. Honest work was for suckers. If you wanted to escape the tenements, you needed different methods. Methods the law didn't approve but poverty demanded. By his early teens, Louis was already involved in petty crime. Theft, pickpocketing, protection rackets. The traditional entry points for ambitious kids from neighborhoods where legitimate opportunities didn't exist. But Louis was different from typical street thugs. He was intelligent, calculating, and organizational in his thinking. Where others saw individual crimes, Louis saw systems and structures waiting to be built. His nickname Lepke came from his mother, a Yiddish diminutive meaning Little Louis. But there was irony in the affectionate nickname, because Louis Buchalter would become one of American organized crime's most dangerous figures. The little boy his mother called Lepke would eventually command an organization that killed hundreds and terrorized an entire city. Louis's early criminal career brought him into contact with other young criminals who'd later become major organized crime figures. Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, the future architects of the American Mafia's modern structure all came from similar backgrounds. They were Jewish and Italian kids from immigrant neighborhoods, smart and ruthless, recognizing that crime offered opportunities that legitimate society denied them. Together, they'd revolutionize American organized crime. In the 1920s, Louis Buchalter found his criminal specialty, labor racketeering. New York's garment industry was massive, employing hundreds of thousands of workers in factories and sweatshops throughout the city. The industry was ripe for exploitation. Workers were desperate and disorganized, owners were competitive and ruthless, and unions were weak and corruptible. Louis saw opportunity everywhere. His method was elegant in its brutality. He'd approach union leaders and offer protection services. Pay him, and he'd ensure labor peace. Refuse, and he'd organize strikes, sabotage production, and destroy businesses. He'd simultaneously approach factory owners with the opposite pitch. Pay him, and he'd control unions and prevent strikes. Refuse, and labor problems would multiply mysteriously. Louis was selling protection from problems he created, extorting both sides of labor disputes. But Louis wasn't just running simple protection rackets. He was systematically taking over entire industries. He'd infiltrate unions, install his associates in leadership positions, and control entire trades through violence and intimidation. Workers who resisted were beaten or killed. Union officials who didn't cooperate disappeared. Factory owners who refused to pay faced strikes that destroyed their businesses. Louis was building an empire on labor extortion. His organization grew rapidly through the late 1920s and early 1930s. Louis controlled trucking unions, bakery delivery unions, and most significantly, garment industry unions. He generated millions annually, taking percentages from union dues, extorting businesses, and controlling entire sectors of New York's economy. It was organized crime operating at a level of sophistication that law enforcement struggled to comprehend. Louis's intelligence and organizational skills distinguished him from typical racketeers. He didn't just shake down random businesses. He studied industries, identified leverage points, and implemented systematic control. He kept records in code, managed accounts, and ran his criminal operations like a legitimate corporation. Violence was a tool deployed strategically rather than randomly, making his organization more effective and more profitable. His relationship with other major organized crime figures was collaborative during this period. Lewis worked closely with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, the architects of what would become known as the National Crime Syndicate. They recognized that cooperation among different ethnic criminal groups was more profitable than competition. Lewis controlled labor rackets, Luciano controlled Italian operations, and Lansky handled financial operations. Together, they were building something unprecedented, a national criminal cartel. In the early 1930s, Louis Buchalter helped create one of organized crime's most infamous innovations, Murder Incorporated. It wasn't actually called that, the name came from journalists, but it accurately described the operation, a contract killing service available to organized crime families nationwide. Need someone killed? Murder Incorporated would handle it for a fee. It was assassination as business, murder systematized and professionalized. The concept was brilliant from an organizational standpoint. Individual crime families had always committed murders, but they used their own members, creating evidence trails and risking exposure. Murder Incorporated provided specialists who weren't connected to the people ordering hits, making prosecutions extremely difficult. The killers didn't know why targets were being eliminated. They just executed contracts and collected payment. It was murder with corporate insulation. Lewis was one of Murder Incorporated's primary managers, though not its only leader. Albert Anastasia, a brutal killer from the Italian mob, was also heavily involved. But Lewis's intelligence and organizational skills made him invaluable. He coordinated contracts, assigned killers, and ensured operations ran smoothly. Murder Incorporated wasn't chaotic. It was methodical, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. The organization operated from Brooklyn, specifically Brownsville, where many of its killers were based. These weren't sophisticated criminals. Many were just tough Jewish and Italian kids willing to kill for money. But Lewis organized them, provided targets, and ensured they understood the rules. Kill professionally, dispose of bodies carefully, and never talk about assignments. Violate these rules and you became the next target. The body count was staggering. Estimates vary, but Murder Incorporated is believed to have killed between 400 and 1,000 people over roughly a decade. Some victims were mob figures targeted in organizational disputes. Others were witnesses who might testify in criminal cases. Some were labor leaders who resisted Lewis's control. And some were simply people who'd crossed someone powerful enough to pay for their death. Murder Incorporated didn't ask questions. It delivered bodies. Lewis's role in Murder Incorporated was strategic rather than operational. He didn't personally kill people. He authorized contracts, managed logistics, and ensured the organization functioned efficiently. It was CEO work applied to assassination, demonstrating Lewis's fundamental approach to crime. Treat it as business, systematize operations, and maximize profits while minimizing risks. That this business was murder didn't change his management methods. Murder Incorporated existed within a larger structure. The National Crime Syndicate, an unprecedented attempt to organize American crime nationally. Louis Buchalter was one of the syndicate's founding members, working alongside Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and other major criminals to create coordination where only competition had existed before. The syndicate's purpose was ending the chaos that had characterized organized crime during Prohibition. Different gangs fighting over territory, ethnic groups refusing to cooperate, violence that attracted law enforcement attention. The old system was wasteful and dangerous. The syndicate proposed cooperation. Different groups would control different operations, disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than war, and everyone would profit more by working together. Lewis's labor rackets fit perfectly into this structure. He controlled unions and industries, generating steady income that could be shared among syndicate members. Other criminals controlled different operations: gambling, bootlegging until Prohibition ended, drugs. Together, they created a diversified criminal portfolio that was extraordinarily profitable and relatively stable. The syndicate also established the Commission, a ruling council that made policy decisions, authorized major operations, and resolved disputes between families. Louis wasn't Italian, so he couldn't be a formal commission member. It was restricted to Italian mafia families. But he participated in discussions and his voice carried significant weight. His intelligence and his control of labor rackets made him indispensable. This national organization represented a revolution in American crime. For the first time, criminals from different cities and different ethnic backgrounds were cooperating systematically. The syndicate established rules, protocols, and communication channels that allowed coordination on a scale previously impossible. It was organized crime actually becoming organized, and Louis Buchalter was one of its architects. But the syndicate's sophistication also created vulnerabilities. The more organized crime became, the more it operated like a legitimate business, and businesses could be investigated, prosecuted, and destroyed through legal means. Federal prosecutors were developing new tools to fight organized crime, including conspiracy laws that made proving individual crimes less necessary. The organization that made Louis powerful would eventually make him vulnerable. In the mid-1930s, Louis Buchalter attracted the attention of Thomas E. Dewey, a crusading prosecutor who'd made destroying organized crime his mission. Dewey was ambitious, intelligent, and ruthless in his pursuit of criminals. He saw organized crime not as individual criminals but as systematic enterprises that required systematic prosecution. And he identified Louis Buchalter as one of his primary targets. Dewey's approach was innovative. Rather than just prosecuting individual crimes, he used conspiracy laws to target entire criminal organizations. He'd flip low-level criminals, offering deals to get testimony against higher-ups. He'd trace financial records to prove illegal income. And he'd build cases that demonstrated patterns of criminal activity rather than just individual acts. It was prosecutorial warfare using new weapons, and Louis was in the crosshairs. Louis's labor rackets made him particularly vulnerable. Unlike some criminal operations that were hidden and hard to prove, labor racketeering left evidence. Union records, business documents, witness testimony from victims. Dewey had hundreds of potential witnesses. Workers who'd been intimidated, union officials who'd been corrupted, business owners who'd paid extortion. Building a case against Louis was possible if Dewey could protect witnesses and overcome the fear Louis generated. Dewey launched investigations into Louis's operations, subpoenaing records, interviewing witnesses, and building a case. Louis responded with his traditional methods, intimidating witnesses, corrupting officials, and when necessary, ordering murders. But Dewey was protected by political support and media attention that made assassinating him extremely risky. Louis could kill random witnesses, but killing a high-profile prosecutor would bring federal heat that even the syndicate couldn't handle. In 1937, Dewey indicted Louis on charges related to labor racketeering in the bakery and flour trucking industries. The indictment alleged systematic extortion, describing how Louis had controlled entire industries through violence and intimidation. It was a serious case with substantial evidence, and Louis knew he was in danger of conviction. His response was characteristic. He went into hiding. Louis's disappearance in 1937 created a bizarre situation. He was one of the most powerful criminals in America, controlling operations worth millions, but he was hiding like a common fugitive. He directed his organization remotely through intermediaries, moving between safe houses, and avoiding law enforcement while maintaining his criminal empire. It was powerful but paranoid, wealthy but imprisoned by the need to hide. Louis was trapped by his own success, too important to abandon his operations, too threatened to operate openly. For over 2 years, from 1937 to 1939, Louis Buchalter lived as a fugitive, hiding from law enforcement while continuing to run his criminal empire. It was an extraordinary situation. A major organized crime figure directing operations from safe houses and secret locations, managing murder and extortion while avoiding arrest himself. Louis's fugitive life was simultaneously powerful and pathetic. He controlled operations worth millions, commanded an organization that included dozens of killers, and influenced industries throughout New York. But he couldn't operate openly, couldn't enjoy his wealth, and lived in constant fear of arrest. He'd created a prison for himself. Not bars and cells, but safe houses and paranoia, isolation and constant vigilance. His organization continued functioning despite his absence from day-to-day operations. Lewis had built sufficiently systematic operations that they could run with him directing remotely. Associates would visit him in hiding, receive instructions, and implement his orders. Murder Incorporated continued killing. Labor rackets continued generating income. The empire Lewis built operated efficiently even with its leader hiding like a rat. But Lewis's fugitive status created problems for the broader syndicate. Law enforcement heat on Lewis meant heat on everyone connected to him. His inability to operate openly disrupted operations that required his direct involvement. And his continued murder of witnesses, trying to eliminate people who might testify against him, was attracting the kind of attention the syndicate wanted to avoid. Lewis was becoming more valuable dead than alive to some of his former associates. The pressure on Lewis intensified throughout 1938 and 1939. Dewey's investigations continued despite Lewis's absence. More indictments were filed, more witnesses came forward, and federal involvement increased. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI designated Lewis as one of their most wanted fugitives, increasing resources dedicated to finding him. The net was tightening, and Lewis's options were narrowing. His psychological state during this period must have been torturous. Lewis had spent decades building power and wealth, and now he was hiding in basements and safe houses, unable to enjoy anything he'd accumulated. The paranoia of knowing everyone was searching for him, combined with the stress of running operations remotely and ordering murders to protect himself, created a nightmare existence. Lewis was trapped by his own crimes, his freedom destroyed by the organization he'd built. On August 24, 1939, Louis Buchalter surrendered to federal authorities in a bizarre arrangement orchestrated by journalist Walter Winchell. Lewis had negotiated through intermediaries, agreeing to surrender to the FBI on narcotics charges, a federal offense that seemed safer than facing Dewey's state charges. The surrender happened on a New York street corner, with Winchell present, as Lewis stepped into a car with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover himself. It was dramatic theater, and Lewis believed he'd negotiated a deal that would protect him from Dewey. He was wrong. The federal narcotics charges were relatively minor, but they got Lewis off the streets. And once in federal custody, Lewis could be transferred to state custody to face Dewey's charges. The deal Lewis thought he'd negotiated, avoiding state prosecution, evaporated. He'd surrendered thinking he was making a strategic move, but he'd actually walked into a trap. Lewis's surrender demonstrated something fundamental about his situation. He'd lost. 2 years of hiding had accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. His organization was under assault, his associates were being arrested, and witnesses were testifying. Lewis could run, but he couldn't escape the legal system's reach forever. Surrender was his last option, and he'd taken it hoping for mercy that would never come. The charges Lewis faced were serious but manageable: labor racketeering and extortion. Under normal circumstances, even convictions might have meant relatively brief prison sentences. But Lewis's case wasn't normal. The murders he'd ordered to protect himself were about to become his undoing. Killing witnesses was supposed to prevent prosecution, but it actually gave prosecutors additional charges that carried the death penalty. Dewey and federal prosecutors now had Lewis in custody, and they intended to keep him there permanently. They'd continue building cases, flipping witnesses, and expanding charges. Lewis had surrendered hoping to control his legal situation, but he'd actually surrendered control completely. From that moment forward, prosecutors would determine his fate, and they intended that fate to be death. While Lewis was in custody, prosecutors were building a case more serious than labor racketeering: murder. Specifically, they focused on the 1936 killing of Joseph Rosen, a former trucker whom Lewis had put out of business and then ordered killed when Rosen threatened to talk to authorities. Rosen's murder was one of many, but it was prosecutable. There were witnesses, evidence, and connections to Lewis that could be proven. Abe "Kid" Twist Rellis, one of Murder Incorporated's primary killers, decided to cooperate with authorities in 1940. Rellis had participated in dozens of murders and knew the organization's operations intimately. His testimony was devastating. He could connect murders to those who ordered them, describe how Murder Incorporated operated, and provide evidence that would have been impossible to obtain otherwise. Rellis became known as the canary who could sing but couldn't fly, and his singing destroyed Louis Buchalter. Rellis testified that Louis had ordered Rosen's murder, explaining the chain of command from Louis's order to the actual killing. He described how Murder Incorporated worked, how contracts were authorized, how killers were assigned, and how operations were coordinated. His testimony provided prosecutors with evidence of a murder conspiracy that led directly to Louis, evidence that could support a capital murder charge. Additional witnesses corroborated Rellis' testimony. Other Murder Incorporated killers, facing their own charges, cooperated and confirmed the organizational structure. The case against Louis became overwhelming. Multiple witnesses describing the same operations, all pointing to Louis as a decision-maker who authorized killings. Prosecutors had what they needed: evidence of murder-for-hire operations with Louis in charge. In 1941, Louis Buchalter was indicted for murder in the first degree in the killing of Joseph Rosen. It was a capital charge carrying the death penalty. Louis now faced not just prison but execution. The labor racketeer who'd built an empire was being prosecuted as a common murderer, and the evidence against him was substantial. His lawyers would fight, but the outcome seemed inevitable. The murder trial began in 1941, and it was a sensation. Prosecutors presented Rellis and other cooperating witnesses who described Murder Incorporated's operations in shocking detail. They explained how Louis had sat at the top of an organization that killed hundreds, how he'd ordered Rosen's death specifically, and how the murder had been carried out. The defense attacked witness credibility, arguing they were criminals lying to reduce their own sentences, but the jury heard something compelling. Multiple witnesses telling consistent stories that painted Louis as a murder conspirator. On November 30, 1941, the jury returned guilty verdicts against Louis Buchalter and two co-defendants on charges of first-degree murder. The verdict meant death. New York State's penalty for first-degree murder was execution. Louis, who'd controlled an organization that killed hundreds, would now be killed by the state. The appeals process would take years, but the ultimate outcome seemed certain. Louis's reaction to the verdict was reportedly calm, but internally he must have been devastated. He'd spent decades building power and accumulating wealth, and now he faced execution. All the murders he'd ordered, all the witnesses he'd killed trying to protect himself, had failed to prevent his conviction. The system he'd believed he could corrupt and manipulate had finally caught him. His co-defendants, Emmanuel Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone, were also convicted and sentenced to death. They'd been the actual killers in Rosen's murder, operating on Louis's orders. Now all three would die together, the boss and his soldiers, united in their fate. It was a rare outcome in organized crime prosecutions. Usually bosses escaped punishment while soldiers went to prison. But Louis's prominence and the nature of the charges meant he wouldn't escape. The appeals process began immediately. Louis's lawyers argued various legal points: that evidence was obtained illegally, that witnesses were unreliable, that the trial was unfair. But appeal after appeal failed. Courts upheld the conviction, finding that the evidence was sufficient, the trial was fair, and Louis deserved his sentence. Each failed appeal brought Louis closer to the electric chair. Louis's situation also created problems for his former associates in the syndicate. His conviction on murder charges with cooperating witness testimony demonstrated that even powerful mob bosses could be successfully prosecuted. It showed that Murder Incorporated secrecy wasn't absolute, that killers would cooperate when facing death themselves, and that the organizational insulation Louis had built couldn't completely protect leadership. His case became a cautionary tale about the risks of systematic violence. During his years on death row, Louis watched the world change. World War II began and progressed, fundamentally altering America. The organized crime landscape shifted as law enforcement developed new tools and cooperating witnesses became more common. And most significantly for Louis, his associates moved on. The syndicate continued operating, labor rackets continued generating income, and life went on without him. Louis was becoming irrelevant, a historical figure awaiting execution while the criminal world he'd helped build evolved without him. Louis Buchalter spent his final years on death row at Sing Sing prison, watching execution dates approach and be delayed by appeals. The condemned prisoners' wing at Sing Sing housed men awaiting execution, living in a strange limbo where death was certain but timing was unknown. Lewis's intelligence and former power meant nothing here. He was just another prisoner waiting to die. His co-defendants, Weiss and Capone, were with him on death row, sharing the strange camaraderie of men awaiting the same fate. They'd killed together for Lewis's organization, been convicted together, and now would die together. The relationship between boss and soldiers that had defined their criminal careers continued into death. Lewis had led them into murder, and now he'd lead them into execution. Lewis's mental state during these years is difficult to determine. He maintained his composure publicly, showing no apparent fear or remorse. But privately, he must have experienced the terror that comes with knowing exactly how and approximately when you'll die. Unlike criminals killed in gang violence, Lewis knew his death would come by electric chair, administered by the state, on a specific date that would eventually be set. That knowledge, death scheduled like an appointment, is a unique form of psychological torture. His family visited occasionally, though these visits must have been excruciating for everyone. Lewis's wife and children watching him on death row, knowing he'd be executed, unable to do anything except wait. The man who'd once been powerful and wealthy was now powerless and dependent on others for even basic necessities. The complete reversal of Lewis's fortunes, from criminal kingpin to death row inmate, was stark and irreversible. Various intervention attempts were made. Some associates allegedly offered bribes to officials who might influence Lewis's case. Political connections were activated, trying to get the death sentence commuted. But nothing worked. The political will to execute Lewis was too strong. Thomas Dewey, now governor of New York, was not going to show mercy to the man whose prosecution had helped build Dewey's political career. Lewis would die, and Dewey would let it happen. The date was eventually set, March 4, 1944. Louis Buchalter, Emanuel Weiss, and Louis Capone would be executed in Sing Sing's electric chair. After years of appeals and delays, the end had finally arrived. The most powerful labor racketeer in American history, the man who'd helped create Murder Incorporated and the National Crime Syndicate, would be killed by the state he'd terrorized for decades. On the evening of March 4, 1944, Louis Buchalter was led to Sing Sing's death chamber. He was 47 years old, had spent decades building criminal power, and now faced execution for murders he'd ordered in pursuit of that power. His co-defendants, Weiss and Capone, would die with him, executed in sequence in New York's electric chair. The execution protocol was methodical. Lewis was strapped into the chair, electrodes attached to his body, his last words recorded. Witnesses, including law enforcement officials, journalists, and the required observers, watched through a window. The executioner waited for the signal. And then, at 11:02 p.m., the electricity was activated. Louis Buchalter's body convulsed as thousands of volts coursed through him. Multiple shocks were administered to ensure death. And then it was over. The man who'd ordered hundreds of deaths was dead himself, killed by the state. Louis Buchalter became the only major organized crime boss ever executed by the government in American history. Other bosses were murdered by rivals, died in prison from natural causes, or lived to old age in freedom or incarceration. But Lewis was killed by the legal system, formally executed after a trial and conviction. His death represented a unique victory for law enforcement. They hadn't just imprisoned a mob boss, they'd killed him legally. His final words were reportedly calm and brief, maintaining the composure he'd shown throughout his imprisonment. But whatever Lewis said, it couldn't change his fate. The electric chair didn't care about his former power or his intelligence. It killed him the same way it killed common murderers, reducing the criminal mastermind to just another executed prisoner. All of Lewis's wealth, power, and criminal genius meant nothing in that moment. Weiss and Capone followed Lewis to the chair minutes later, executed for their roles in the same murder. The three men who'd worked together in Murder Incorporated, who'd killed for money and power, died together by state execution. Their bodies were claimed by families, buried quietly, and their deaths marked the end of an era in American organized crime. Louis Buchalter's execution sent shockwaves through organized crime. If the government could execute a major boss, no one was safe. The belief that powerful mobsters could avoid ultimate punishment, that at worst they'd do prison time, was shattered. Lewis's death demonstrated that capital murder charges could reach even the highest levels of criminal organizations, and that cooperating witnesses could provide the evidence necessary for conviction. Murder Incorporated was effectively destroyed by the prosecutions that killed Lewis. Abe Relis, the primary witness, died mysteriously in 1941, falling from a window while in protective custody. Almost certainly murdered by corrupt cops working for the mob. But his testimony had already done its damage. Other Murder Incorporated killers were prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned. The organization that had killed hundreds was dismantled, its members dead, imprisoned, or hiding. The National Crime Syndicate survived Lewis's execution but was fundamentally weakened. The cooperation between ethnic criminal groups continued, but the systematic murder-for-hire operations that Murder Incorporated represented were scaled back dramatically. The execution demonstrated that such operations created too much risk, too many witnesses, too much evidence, too much potential for catastrophic prosecutions. Organized crime became more cautious, less systematically violent. Thomas Dewey's career benefited enormously from prosecuting Lewis. He'd shown he could take down major criminals, earning a reputation as a crime fighter that propelled him to the governorship of New York and eventually to running for president. He lost to Franklin Roosevelt and later to Harry Truman. Lewis's execution was a cornerstone of Dewey's political identity, proof that he could defeat organized crime. For labor unions, Lewis's death marked the beginning of decades-long efforts to purge mob influence. Federal authorities used his conviction as justification for investigating union corruption systematically. The Landrum-Griffin Act and other legislation gave government tools to combat labor racketeering. While mob influence in unions didn't disappear immediately, Lewis's prosecution began the process of reducing that influence. Louis Buchalter's legacy is primarily as a cautionary tale. He demonstrated that intelligence and organization could build massive criminal enterprises, but also that those same qualities made prosecution possible. The systematic operations that made Lewis successful created records, witnesses, and evidence that prosecutors could use. His execution proved that even the most powerful criminals could face ultimate justice. For law enforcement, Lewis represented both victory and warning. Victory because they'd successfully prosecuted and executed a major organized crime figure. Warning because it required extraordinary effort. Years of investigation, cooperating witnesses willing to risk death, and prosecutorial resources that weren't always available. Replicating that success would be difficult and rare. For organized crime, Lewis's story taught clear lessons. Systematic violence attracts systematic prosecution. Witnesses will cooperate when facing death themselves. And no amount of power or wealth guarantees protection from the legal system. Modern organized crime learned from Lewis's mistakes, becoming less centralized, less systematically violent, and more careful about leaving evidence trails. The concept of Murder Incorporated, a professional killing organization operating like a business, fascinated Americans and became part of popular culture. Books, movies, and television shows have depicted Murder Incorporated, usually portraying Lewis as its evil genius. This cultural legacy probably exceeds Lewis's actual historical importance. He's remembered more for the dramatic nature of his crimes and execution than for his actual impact on organized crime's development. Lewis's execution also represented a specific moment in American criminal justice history. The death penalty was still commonly applied, cooperating witnesses were becoming valuable prosecution tools, and organized crime was seen as a threat requiring aggressive response. That moment would eventually pass. Death penalty use would decline, organized crime would diminish, and criminal justice would evolve. But Lewis's execution captured that era perfectly. After Lewis's execution and the prosecutions of other key members, Murder Incorporated ceased to exist as a functional organization. The systematic murder-for-hire operation that had killed hundreds was destroyed by the very violence it had implemented. The killers who'd carried out contracts were now imprisoned or cooperating with authorities. The bosses who'd ordered hits were dead or hiding. The infrastructure that had made professional murder possible was dismantled. Some individual killers survived and continued working for various crime families. But the centralized, syndicate-wide assassination service was finished. Different families returned to using their own members for violence, accepting the increased risks that came with less professional killings. The efficiency Murder Incorporated had provided was lost, but so was the organizational vulnerability it had created. The cooperating witnesses who destroyed Murder Incorporated faced various fates. Abe Relis died mysteriously in 1941. Others entered witness protection or served reduced sentences and disappeared into obscurity. Some were eventually killed by former associates seeking revenge. Cooperation saved them from execution but couldn't provide permanent safety. The choice between death row and witness testimony was ultimately a choice between immediate death and possible future death. Neither option was truly safe. The neighborhoods where Murder Incorporated had operated, primarily Brownsville and Brooklyn, changed dramatically over subsequent decades. The Jewish and Italian criminals who'd formed the organization's core were replaced by different ethnic groups and different criminal enterprises. The physical locations where murders had been planned and bodies disposed of became ordinary streets, with no markers indicating their dark history. Law enforcement studied Murder Incorporated extensively, learning lessons about how to investigate and prosecute organized crime. The case demonstrated the value of cooperating witnesses, the importance of following financial trails, and the necessity of protecting witnesses from retaliation. These lessons would be applied to future organized crime prosecutions, making each subsequent case slightly more effective. Today, Louis Buchalter is largely forgotten outside organized crime history enthusiasts and scholars. His name doesn't resonate with general public the way Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, or John Gotti do. But within criminal history, Louis remains significant as the only major mob boss ever executed by the state, a distinction that is simultaneously honorific and damning. His grave in New York receives occasional visitors, researchers, true crime enthusiasts, people fascinated by Murder Incorporated's history. They photograph the headstone, note his dates, and move on. Louis's physical memorial is modest, bearing no indication of his criminal career or execution. Just another grave in a Jewish cemetery, marking the remains of a man who terrorized New York for decades. The industries Louis controlled, garment manufacturing, trucking, bakeries, have largely left New York or evolved beyond recognition. The labor rackets he pioneered still exist in various forms, but modern versions are less violent and more sophisticated. The crude extortion Louis practiced has been replaced by more subtle forms of corruption that are harder to prosecute but also less profitable. His family's fate after his execution is mostly private. Louis's wife and children presumably tried to build lives separate from his criminal legacy, adopting new names or simply avoiding discussion of their connection to an executed mobster. The shame of having a family member executed for murder for hire is profound, creating trauma that likely affected multiple generations. Academic interest in Louis continues. Historians study his labor racketeering methods, sociologists analyze Murder Incorporated's organizational structure, and criminologists examine his prosecution as a case study in how to dismantle criminal enterprises. Louis has become a historical figure, his life reduced to data points and lessons rather than remembered as a living person. The fundamental irony of Louis Buchalter's life is that his intelligence and organizational skills, the qualities that made him successful, ultimately led to his execution. A less intelligent criminal might have avoided systematic operations that left evidence trails. A less organized one might not have built Murder Incorporated, which provided prosecutors with cooperating witnesses and clear conspiracy charges. Louis's strengths became his weaknesses, and the empire he built became his tomb. Louis Buchalter, called Lepke, Little Louis, built an empire on labor racketeering and systematic murder. He created Murder Incorporated, killed hundreds through proxies, generated millions in illegal profits, and helped organize American crime nationally. Then he was prosecuted, convicted, and executed by the state, dying in Sing Sing's electric chair at 47. He became the only major mob boss ever executed by the government, proving that intelligence and organization can build criminal empires but also make them prosecutable. Every murder he ordered to protect himself created evidence that led to his conviction. Every witness he killed made prosecutors more determined to execute him. And in the end, the man who treated murder as business was murdered by the business he'd created. Not by rivals, but by the legal system that finally caught the most systematic killer in American organized crime history.